Okay, now we turn to the important but necessary question of how do we pay for all of this? We've heard some great ideas, we've heard some important needs for the field. Where does the funding come from? Where does the money come from to help pay for all of this? So our next panel is going to answer that whole question for us. We have nothing else to worry about. But while they're coming up, let me just add again a huge thanks to our foundation community here in Pittsburgh and also to other foundations outside of Pittsburgh who were very generous sponsors. They are listed on our website. I'm not going to take the time to list them all here because we are trying to get this panel up, but we're incredibly grateful to all of them for their support for making this happen. So this particular panel is going to talk about financing, and we thought we would organize it under 4 categories of funding. And the 4 categories, very broadly drawn, that we often rely on for important community projects are government, philanthropy, venture capital, and private funding. And so we're going to take those sort of in this order. And we're going to start off with John Picarelli, who you met once before, from the Department of Homeland Security. And he's going to talk to us first about the kind of programs and the kind of funding that is available through government, U.S. government sources. John?
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just preface my remarks that I'm really speaking from over a decade of experience being in a prior role as a grant manager with the Department of Justice. So what I want to do is talk to you today about different grant programs in the federal government and more give you some practical advice that I developed over that time working with a wide variety of potential applicants. I'll just preface this by saying also that this is really just my own personal observations. What I'm going to try and do is give you some practical advice to help kickstart you developing high quality applications for grant programs. But my overarching advice at the end, I think you'll hear, is the best thing to do is to connect with those who run these grant programs and understand what they want. So let me start out by saying that, sadly, the grant-making process in the federal government can be pretty impenetrable. I don't know if anyone remembers the guy who used to be on TV and he had all the question marks on his suit and he sold the big, thick book of all the grant opportunities that were out there. I think the creation of the internet probably put him out of business, but this was there for a reason. It was hard to locate grants. So when you are thinking about obtaining a federal grant, you need to know what agency to go to. And there are many different agencies that offer grants. Where I used to be, the Department of Justice has what's known as the Office of Justice Programs, and within there are a number of different bureaus that offer grants. You have one on statistics, one on research and evaluation, one for law enforcement and criminal justice programs, an office for victims of crime. You have juvenile justice and delinquency prevention and so forth. They all offer grants. And so what you need to do there is to take a look at each organization and understand what their funding priorities are and the types of awards they want to make. That's just one agency. There are agencies like the Department of Homeland Security who gives out grants. In part, the way we give out grants through our Homeland Security Grant Program is mainly to states and to government agencies to support the state and local costs of Homeland Security. But we do also give out grants to nonprofit organizations. And I'll talk about our own grant program in a little bit. But then there are more social service and domestic agencies that give out grants. The Department of Education has a wide variety of grant programs that are available to potential applicants that aren't necessarily school districts and so forth. Health and Human Services has a wide variety of grant programs available. HUD, labor, etc. The best place to learn what grant programs are out there is now what's known as grants.gov. We all are forced in the federal government to list our grant solicitations at grants.gov. So if you learn how to search on grants.gov by keyword, you will start to find grant programs that meet your requirements. What is it that you want to do, okay? And this is going to be a constant refrain throughout this talk. Now is the time to start looking, and I will come back why. But now, right now, is the time to go start perusing that. One other thing I just want to touch on is when we talk about grants, grants are not a homogeneous thing. There are grants that go out, what I used to do at Justice Department, were research and evaluation grants. Those are a specific type that usually go to academic institutions to do exactly what it sounds like: conduct research, conduct evaluations. You also have programmatic grants. These are more where you want to build something that will have an impact of some kind. You also can have, there are what are known as block grant programs. These are where a block of money is provided to an awardee to then take and sub-award to a number of grantees. This is in part what the Homeland Security grant program is, but other grant programs provide money to the states, and then the states take that money and award it competitively. And then finally, there's a type of grant called a cooperative agreement. And what this is essentially you're going to enter into a binding arrangement with the government, so that as a grant manager, if I was in a cooperative agreement with a university, I would actually be working on the project as the grant manager part of my time with the university. And so these can be a really interesting way to work with some subject matter experts in the federal government while also developing your idea. Briefly, I wanted to touch on state and local grants. As I mentioned, there are plenty of grant programs that are available at the state level. Some of them are funded by the federal government, many are not. These usually have the same types of criteria, but you're not going to find them on grants.gov. You have to go into your state and look at where the grant making occurs within the state, and then start to look at the different types of programs. Google is probably your best friend here. And grant making is usually the key word in there. And I know that we have some other speakers here today that'll talk about non-government sources of grants, but one thing I just wanted to highlight is there's a tremendous number of foundations here in the United States that offer grants. I was talking to someone this morning about one large philanthropy who awards grants for organizations that show promise, but they need that stability of funding for a number of years in order to grow and be sustainable. And so the foundation makes those awards, and they're sizable, but they're for 4, 5, 6 years worth of funding. For foundations, there are a number of, there's a website called Foundation Finder, and there are others. But foundations usually run on a different cycle, where the government usually tends to make awards one time a year. And so there'll be a period of time during the calendar year that will be when a solicitation or a notice of funding opportunity opens and when it closes. Foundations usually work off of about a 6-month cycle. And the way that you get an award from a foundation is usually you start to talk to the program managers at the foundation about your idea, and you get them interested, and they ask you to work up a proposal. They're the ones who present it to the board of the foundation every 6 months, okay? For the federal government, and this is where I wanted to, well, let me pause on that. I'll come back to how you actually do a grant in a moment. One thing I just wanted to touch on is that, as you know, I'm the director of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. We do have a grant program. Our grant program right now is funded at $20 million a year. We just made our awards for the previous fiscal year. We made 37 awards pegged exactly at $20 million. We spent every last penny. The awards that we make fund everything from the construction of prevention programs, holistic prevention programs at the local level, to more bespoke programs that would fit into that more holistic program. So think a training initiative or an engagement function of some kind, or building out behavioral threat analysis and management teams. And then we also fund an innovation line of grants, which is exactly what it sounds like. I have an idea, it's never been tried before, I want to test it and see if it works. We'll fund that if it's good. So how do you actually do this? How do you actually get a grant? So I'm going to stick to the federal government for the moment. The federal government's fiscal year runs, and it starts on October 1st, and it runs through September 30th. Most all grant funding is funded in a way that it has to be expended every fiscal year, which means that as grant managers, we have to get the money out the door by September 30th. So the reason right now is the time to get all your ducks in a row, is we just rolled over into the new fiscal year. And at the speed of government, the quickest you can usually get your grant notice of funding opportunities out the door is a few months. So now is the perfect time to start looking in grants.gov, mainly at what was funded last year, but anticipating what's coming up this year. You are going to need to have certain prerequisites in place in order to apply. This is another reason you want to start right now. If you're an organization and you don't have a DUNS number, you need to do that right now. If you're an organization and you haven't registered on grants.gov, you need to do that right now. And the reason is simple. Some of these things you can just do. Let's say a notice of funding opportunity opens up on January 1st. You can do it pretty much immediately and apply. But some of these can take weeks to come through. And there was nothing more depressing, in spite of all the verbiage we would build into our solicitations, begging our applicants, the moment you crack open this and get excited by what we're offering, please make sure you have the following in place. Those who procrastinated and called me the night before, or sometimes an hour before, the application was due and wondered why they couldn't put their application in, and it was because they didn't have a DUNS number. I was the person who had to tell them, I'm sorry, you can't apply. So this month or two that you have spent sweating and toiling, putting together the perfect application package, I'm sorry, you can't apply. That was completely outside of my control. It is a prerequisite of any federal grant program to have a DUNS number. So now is the time to start looking at grants, who offers what. Now is the time to start looking at what are the prerequisites for those grants. Another thing that's really helpful to do now is to start to reach out to the grant managers themselves. Most every grant program has an email, either a name associated with it or just a Dropbox. Reach out to them and start to talk to them. One of the things that is really critical is to ask a lot of questions. One of the worst things that can happen is to receive an application that's a wonderful application, but actually it's not something that you can fund as a grant manager. It's not the right grant program. So it's perfectly in line to call up a grant manager to request a meeting and say, I'm not asking whether you would fund this or not. I'm simply asking, I have this idea. Is this something that would be considered an applicable use of your grant funds in your grant program? Simple as that. And if it's not, well, where should I go? It may be in the same agency and so forth. As I mentioned, you should be looking at not only taking your idea and translating it into a grant application, but also looking at how would you resource it? What's your budget going to be? Do you need to have partners on this to get this to work? If so, you want to start contacting those partners now and entering into agreements. Every grant program is slightly different in how they like to structure their responses. You need to pay attention to that. One piece of really practical advice: when grant applications come in, we usually have a few weeks to read them all. Sometimes these are 15 to 30 pages long each, and then with attachments and budgets and what have you, give me a couple hundred pages each. And we still have a day job. So we don't always have the time that we like to read through grant applications. Make life easy. Make your headers responsive to the things that have to be in the grant application. Don't make people go hunting for the information. If the solicitation says you have to have an introduction, a statement of key personnel, a statement of methodology, et cetera, those should be your headers. Make it really easy, okay? One other piece of practical advice: most every grant program will publish successful applications. It'll be redacted for anything that is proprietary, of course, and names and such. But if they don't, you can request one through FOIA. The Freedom of Information Act, you can file. You're not going to get unsuccessful or denied applications, but successful ones generally will be released via FOIA. They may be redacted. Why do you want one of those? See what worked to get somebody else a grant. Model your application on that. Don't recreate the wheel. I think the last thing, and I'll end here because I think I'm at time, is just understand that grants are a wonderful way to do work, whether it's research or programs or what have you, but they do come with an administrative burden, okay? There is the amount of time you're going to need to spend to apply, but there are requirements when you take a federal grant that regard oversight of funds, timekeeping, record keeping, both during the grant period, at the closeout of the grant, and then beyond. They're usually well worth it. But as someone who maybe is starting a new organization, is looking to grow that organization, you have to kind of walk into this with the forethought of knowing I'm going to be the one that has to keep track of all this, and that's going to be less of my time that I can spend on other things I'm doing right now. And I mention this because one grant usually isn't going to be a problem, but when you start getting multiple grants, it can become quite the burden, and you will not have nearly as much time to spend on being the leader of your organization or the visionary of your organization. You will become much more about the management and the oversight of your organization, unless you're looking at using some of those grant funds to bring on administrative support. So I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you, John. And for an idea, just to sort of throw out there, as Mark and I will explain shortly, there are going to be specific working groups that emanate out of this summit. And how cool would it be if those working groups had an organized list of the grants that actually could be applicable to fund that program, as opposed to just, sending us off to the morass of websites. So that might be an interesting subject to kind of index. So the second speaker is Rachel Kleinfeld, who's going to talk to us about foundations. And the foundation community, as John mentioned, is so important, particularly in the United States, but also abroad. And as somebody who is blessed to be able to work with foundations a lot, they are super conversant in many ideas, early child education, other things that they have worked in for a long time. The area of hate and eradicating hate and how you take on these issues is something new that the foundation community of this country is just beginning to get their arms around. And Rachel is one of the national experts to whom they have turned for that help. So we're really, really blessed to have you here today, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's a huge honor to be invited, and I'm so sorry not to be there. We had a COVID case in my daughter's first grade, and I'm grounded as a result. But it's easy to see this as an area for government to fund. And John just did the best fundraising 101 of the whole of government arena that I've ever heard. I started my career as a fundraiser in a lowly nonprofit role, and I ran a nonprofit for a decade on that side of the fundraising arena, and now I get to work with philanthropists. And I'm going to zoom out right now and suggest this is an area where private philanthropy is vitally needed. But as Laura just suggested, it's punching well below its weight for a number of reasons. So I'm going to showcase 3 reasons why it's punching below its weight, talk a little bit about what it is doing, and then spend a minute on what it could be doing. So first, especially in the US, targeted violence, and I'm going to talk about targeted violence rather than eradicating hate, because as a lot of speakers have said over the last couple of days, I've been watching the whole thing online, it's easy to deal with violence, or easier, or hate is something in our hearts and souls and a little harder to deal with. But especially in the US, targeted hate is seen as a very new problem for philanthropists. Now, that's not actually true. We faced significant targeted hate in the 19th century against Catholics, African Americans during Reconstruction, Chinese and other immigrants out west in the 20s, low-scale violence against African Americans in the 50s, white supremacy in the 70s. This is a part of our history, and it would be really nice if we recognized this. And philanthropy actually played a crucial role in stemming waves of violence in the 50s and 60s, the recurrence of the Klan in the 70s through civil impact litigation. But all that said, that's my historical hat. This is seen as new to philanthropists, and some aspects certainly are new. And that means that philanthropy has not yet fully connected the dots between different kinds of violence, hate crimes, other kinds of targeted violence, what we're seeing against school boards and so on. And particularly, philanthropy hasn't made a really tight connection between the violent acts themselves and the issues that are affected by targeted violence. And since violence is not really a category in philanthropy yet, it doesn't fall into the categories that philanthropy targets. So targeted violence affects who can participate in our democracy. So it affects democracy programs. It affects how cities conduct basic business, how law enforcement operates. So it affects governance programs and programs to make governments work. It affects our schools, as Cynthia Miller-Idris and her panel just discussed. And so it affects education programs. It affects how businesses operate. I had the opportunity to speak to Walmart, talk about affecting how businesses operate. So that's an area of philanthropy. It affects our media landscape. That's an area of philanthropy. So philanthropists need to start mainstreaming targeted violence within these other areas that are very well established, and see it as part of those problem sets. Second, while we are treating violence as separate from these areas, another challenge is addressing violence as knitting together these siloed specialties that don't usually work together. And that's really important because sometimes what we might end up doing is giving with one hand and taking with another. And let me just illustrate. Consider pro-democracy donors. You might be trying to fight violence with one hand, but we know that small dollar donors are increasing extremist politicians. A lot of the most extreme politicians are really being backed by smaller dollar donors. Some pro-democracy donors see small dollar donors as a pro-democracy move. That's an issue. That's a real tension. We need to think about that tension. Or we might realize that groups that are getting out the vote and really trying to motivate people to get out the vote are doing that in ways that are also increasing hate or increasing polarization, because it's really easy to get out the vote based on saying they're taking away your X. That increase in polarization can fund hate. So we really need to think about those unintended consequences as we start mainstreaming this activity. Third, there's been this real effort to treat this as bipartisan or nonpartisan, and that's essential. As Colin Clark and his panel discussed, this is just a third rail, and if we don't treat it as nonpartisan, it's not going to go anywhere. But the effort to treat it as nonpartisan has also made it into an apolitical area, and that's ignoring reality. And ignoring reality is not good when you're looking for solution sets. In international peacekeeping and peace building, what we've seen is that M&E and big sort of studies of studies, big meta studies, the kind of Campbell Collective things, have found that individual interventions can absolutely work to help individuals. You can pull individuals out of violence, but they actually don't aggregate to solutions to society-wide violence. You can't solve social and political problems by treating them as problems of thousands of single individuals. And that's because single individuals exist. We exist in collections of individuals. We exist as socially networked people. So these really important programs like de-radicalization and so on are crucial. I'm not saying that they're not, they're absolutely important. But we also have to address why there's been such exponential growth in targeted violence in a very short time. We need to take these network effects of violence really seriously because we exist in societies, we're influenced by social networks. The networks are influenced by culture and politics. We're wired to be social, and we get dopamine hits. Every time we have an individual act of violence, people are playing to communities. They're playing to communities online, even if they're incels who are sort of taking pleasure in the loneliness of their community. There's a community, as we were just hearing. And they're trying to aggrandize themselves to something bigger than themselves. And so a lot of our phenomenal discussions these past few days and a lot of philanthropy nowadays has been staying on pretty safe ground and not addressing some of these deeper social and political areas. As I wrote in this Journal of Democracy article that just came out yesterday, we've had this problem in America for a long time, this kind of political and social level of violence. It's recurring. And as we start dealing with those political and social areas, it pulls us into tougher problems for philanthropy. So this is how philanthropy would usually address a problem. You would have individual donors, like we're about to hear from Dawn, doing fabulous personal work in local areas, often focused on relationships they have, instincts, they're going to take more risks, they're going to pilot change. Individual donors get to do things like that. Then you'd have more institutional and foundational donors, and they would undertake learning and assessment to better understand the breadth of a problem, what tactics have empirical validity. And they'd learn from that growing body of evidence, they'd create a theory of the case, they'd discuss it with each other, they'd share their learning, and they'd create a field of actors who'd fund in this area. They might create a table to discuss their work or a funding pool to work together. And in a best case scenario, like in the criminal justice reform work, you'd have that be bipartisan and work together on an agreed kind of theory of the case and shared groups. And you'd get a mix of short-term interventions to address rapid response, hold perpetrators accountable, deterrence actions, and the kind of individual prevention that we've heard so much about the last couple of days. And then you'd also have long-term actions that would work on social and political drivers of these problems, like the way our elections are pushing towards extremes and incentivizing politicians to drive followers toward normalizing extreme behavior, or the geographic sorting of our population that's creating really homogenous groups that are leading people to be quicker to anger to defend their groups, decline of cross-cutting civic organizations such as unions or third identities that sort our populations across partisan characteristics, those deep, long-term social and political issues that need to be addressed. This is just the beginning of the field. So we're getting that short-term action, and in the short-term space, really just that individual-oriented space. So insofar as we've started, we're just sort of at that little bit of it. As Rajiv was saying this morning, every individual action is very socially related, and so we need to start getting into those longer-term social and political drivers. And then we need to start looking at tables and building out bipartisan work. We've got some folks supporting research, not many, as we've been hearing throughout. We need more research on just about everything. And that research also needs to be better disseminated. The research that we have is still pretty broken up. So I'd say three things need to change, and I'll end here. First, there's been a real desire on foundation side to minimize risk. It's too unknown, it's too scary, it's too political, and so let's just study the problem to death. And the problem is, this problem is growing really fast, and violence begets violence. We know that one of the most causal factors related to targeted kinds of violence is people being targeted. It normalizes it. And so you really need to get ahead of this problem. And we need foundations to be a little less risk averse. They need to have a more of a venture capital approach. And hopefully we'll hear more about this. You can't know the problem and solve it. It's altering too quickly. You need to iterate. Two, in other countries, we talk about conflict sensitivity, being careful not to make the problem worse by who you're funding. Here we have that same problem. Different groups are targeted, but as we've heard throughout the last couple of days, there is a real intersectionality. When hate goes up for one group, it goes up for everybody. And by focusing on your group and not this group, I'm part of this minority and not this minority. I work only on these groups and not on these groups. These ones don't fall into my funder category. We're really missing the forest for the trees. And we also can risk causing tensions within these different communities because, frankly, some groups in America are wealthier than other groups in America and have more access to funds. And we need to be really, really aware in the private philanthropic world who's getting those funds and who are we helping and how do we spread that around so that we create an ecosystem approach where all the groups are getting support and building trust and reducing the risk to everyone altogether. And the final thing I'll say is that we are an incredibly generous nation. The amount that this nation gives is immense. And we can tackle this problem. We can tackle this problem through the kinds of things that individual donors are doing, foundations, corporations, but we need to be following the data, as so many people have said. It's really easy to give to feel-good programs here that actually can backfire. And there's some really good research on things that folks like to give to, like the kind of building bridges programs that just bring people together across divides. The best case there is Dawn's. What Dawn is about to tell you, I'm not going to presage it, empirically works. Worst case is things like political divides with older adults, where there's just no empirical work that suggests that kind of building bridges is robust with ascribed characteristics, chosen characteristics rather than ascribed, and older folks and so on. So we really need to be data-based, and while we're iterating and taking risk, we need to be building M&E into everything. And I'll close there.
Great, Rachel, thank you so much. And I'm hearing some very hopeful alignment between people who want to deliver more data and the foundations who need the data that they want to deliver. So I'm seeing some intersectionality there. Hopefully it will be good. You did mention the importance of venture capital and the movement of the power of capitalism to bring to the fight. And Ilana Diamond not only was one of the spearheading leaders of the wonderful venture fair that was done. I don't know how many of you had a chance to go see the finals, but also really an expert in the space nationally. So Ilana, do you want to talk to us about how to mobilize private capital to this problem?
Thank you. Yes. So I'm the managing partner of 412 Venture Capital Fund, and we are a venture capital fund that invests in and supports early stage companies. So to give you an idea of what I mean by that, compared to the kinds of companies that you might invest in on the stock market, these companies are way, way earlier. Maybe they have a product that's just minimally working. They might have a couple of customers, but they've got a lot to prove still. They're very high risk investments, and they can also be very high reward investments. And so it's an entirely different process, the way these ideas get funded. And I think it has real merit for some of the things that folks have been talking about here, how we solve hate and how we find solutions to eradicate hate. So I was asked to talk about how private funding can help bring solutions to this problem and into the hands of people who want to use it. And so I'm just going to hit on three main points. I'm going to talk a little bit about how venture capital and early stage investing works in general to give those folks who might be seeking venture capital for an idea they have to eradicate hate. And then I'm going to talk about why I believe that for-profit solutions make a lot of sense as a way to create social impact and change. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how early stage investment and private investment can support social impact goals like eradicating hate. So starting out on how venture capital and early stage investing works, folks like 412 Venture Fund go out into the world and identify people who want to invest in the kinds of companies that we're looking at, okay? So we talk to individuals, we talk to corporations, we talk to foundations, we talk to government, we talk to private institutions that are looking to invest funds. And one thing they all have in common is they're all looking for a return on their investment, okay? They're expecting us to identify early stage companies that could return capital to them and make a good investment for them. So as venture capitalists, we have a lot of responsibility in the sense that we're deciding what ideas get to market, what kinds of founders get funded. And we have to be very thoughtful about that, because you've probably read in the papers, there's a lot of talk about how 90-something% of all the venture capital funding goes to white male founders, and it goes to ideas that venture capitalists were comfortable with and understand, as opposed to some of the things that could really have a social impact, okay? And so this is a real challenge for us, is because on the one hand, we've made a commitment to our investors and they're expecting return. On the other hand, we have a commitment to our communities to bring new ideas to the fore, to invest in founders who maybe are different than the founders that were invested in the past. And I just want to say, people have talked a lot about data. The data absolutely supports that more diverse teams and more diverse founders get better returns, better financial returns, I should say, in some cases by as much as 30 to 40%. So that's a big reason, even if you're only focused on the financial returns, to be thinking about some of these issues. So why do I think that for-profit solutions are a good way to address things like eradicating hate? I mean, we have the foundations, we have government. Isn't that their job? And yes, I think in some cases it is, but I also believe that when a for-profit company addresses a problem, they have to find people who will open their wallet and pay for the solution that they're providing. And that means they have to be efficient, and that solution has to be effective, and that it has to be better than the other things that are out there on the market. And that's a forcing function, right? So by requiring a financial return, in many cases, you're also supporting a more efficient, effective solution to the problem that you're trying to address. And we really believe that for-profit approaches to some of these social impact problems can be as effective or more effective in solving the problems. And so how can private investment support social impact goals like eradicating hate? Well, this is where every single one of you in the audience comes in, because when funds like ours go out to raise investment, to invest in companies, we're listening to the investors, what they want. And if you're telling us that, yes, we want a return, but we also want solutions that create social impact, that reduce inequality, that support racial justice, that eradicate hate, that fight terrorism, that fight misinformation, if that's where you're voting with your dollars, then that's where funders are going to put their money. And so if you're interested in the very early stages and you can bear a little more risk, and with some of your funds, maybe you're looking for a higher return, then venture capital funds who approach you, if you're talking about those social impact issues that are important to you, they're going to listen. And I can tell you that in the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen a plethora of funds that support female founders, that support Black founders, that support issues like eradicating hate. Those kinds of funds didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. And why did they come to be? Because folks like you decided to vote with your dollars. And so what I would say is that if these are important issues to you, you should be thinking about where you invest and how you invest. And if early stage is too high risk, you know, there are plenty of stock market funds that also address these social impact issues. And this is one way that every single person here can have an impact on eradicating hate and solving some of the issues that have been addressed here.
Great. Thank you so much, Ilana. And last but certainly not least, Dawn Collins and her husband, Rick Collins, have done some enormously impactful work, both in terms of their own foundation, but also in terms of in-kind contributions of their time and their hearts to show real investments that pay off. So if you could talk to us about both kinds of the work that you have done.
Again, thank you for having me. It has been wonderful. I've met some wonderful people, had some wonderful conversations going forward. So when my son was murdered at the University of Maryland, there were 2 things that we could have done, my husband and I. We could have put our heads down and been remorseful and say, we don't want to talk. But we knew that that's not who our son was. So my husband and I came together and said, you know what, let's start a foundation. And we had no idea as to what we were talking about when we said it, but we had some great people that partnered with us and said, you can do this. And so it was remarkable, the people that came and helped us. We did garner some financial support, and we're always looking for more, of course. But what we also found was people were willing to help us, as you said, in kind. So the things that we were able to do is I spoke about the Social Justice Alliance. And when I'm speaking about the Social Justice Alliance, this is the University of Maryland and Bowie State University. These are 2 entities that are less than 10 miles apart. Now, my son was to be a graduate of Bowie State, but he was murdered on the campus of the University of Maryland, College Park. And I went to the presidents of both of those universities and said, we need to do something together so that we can talk about this and solve this issue of hate. And you want to know something? They agreed. And so now we have a symposium that we hold, and we talk about eradicating hate and what it is that we need to do to combat this. So these are great thinkers, and it's wonderful to see them come together. Something else, and again, we're marveling at the things that we were able to accomplish. My son was an ROTC student, so the Army was very important to him. That was his life. He believed in it with all his heart. We were speaking with some senior officers, and they were telling us about training. And they said, you know, Mrs. and Mrs. Collins, sometimes we go to these trainings and we see cadets from Bowie State, which is an HBCU on one side, and cadets from the University of Maryland on the other side. And my husband and I said, you know, but we're talking about the United States Army. Is there something that we can do to bring these cadets together so that they can work together and form those lifelong partnerships? Well, let me tell you this. We were able to garner the support of the Outward Bound Foundation. And what they have agreed to do is have a week-long session with cadets from Bowie State and cadets from the University of Maryland working together all week long out in the woods. I was going to say the brush, but out in the woods, and learning that buddy system of depending on each other. And I would say I have friends from when I was in undergraduate school, and they're my lifelong friends. And I'm sure that these young cadets, soon to be officers in the military, will form bonds that will be forever lasting. And they will learn it's not white, it's not black, but a buddy, someone that I can depend on in this nation. And the last thing that Rick and I were able to do in forming a partnership is with the other families. It's so very important for the world to hear. The victims, the survivors. And so we've partnered with the other families, and you saw some of them here today. And Susan Bro, whose daughter Heather Heyer was murdered at Charlottesville. And organizations like SPLC, the Lawyers Committee, ADL. Again, it is phenomenal that we were able to do this. And in closing, I'm going to say this, and I've said this over and over again. We are more impactful together. There are more of us than them. And it's an analogy that I like to pass on. If I hit you with my hand and it's open, I may smack you and leave a mark. But if I'm together with my fists, I can knock it out. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And the last question, we just have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to sort of throw this out to all of you. One of the functions of this summit is to have people coordinate across silos, to figure out how to coordinate better so that the overall system works better. I'd be interested if any of our panelists have ideas about how the public sector, the private money sector, the philanthropy sector, and families can better coordinate their efforts to have a better, more rationalized funding system for the fight against hate. John, you want to take that softball question?
I really don't like you. Kidding, of course. So thoughts. So there's a couple different ways to do this. One way is that when I was at the Justice Department, we often ask this question: how can we be more innovative in using our funding to bring disparate teams together and build strength through diversity? And so we used to use what were known as researcher-practitioner partnerships. We actually would fund them. We would make it a requirement of a grant to say, we don't want to just fund a good idea. We want to fund a good idea that's bound to research. Oftentimes that could be an evaluation component as well. And so it required a teaming arrangement between, let's say, a law enforcement agency and a university. That's one way. Another way, and this is more difficult because this is where all the lawyers need to get involved, Laura, is that we use the term public-private partnership as a piece of jargon that sounds really cool, right? You hear this all the time. We're going to enter into a public-private partnership. Okay, great. I have actually seen public-private partnerships that work, okay? we, in a previous instantiation of my office, actually looked to create a way to take applicants that we thought were really good, but we just didn't have enough money to fund, and make the philanthropic community aware of them. Mm-hmm. And we got a good distance, but these are good ideas to work on, and they're not impossible. They just take a bunch of people getting into a room together with the right set of lawyers and say, how do we balance the public interest with the private interest? How do we ensure there's no conflicts of interest? And a lot of it is just information sharing and such. How do you also look at funding mechanisms? And it was said earlier, how do you look at funding mechanisms that perhaps use public funding through grants as a catalyst for broader private investment? One last thing I'll mention, and I neglected to mention this in my original remarks. Government funding tends to be large. We tend to fund in hundreds of thousands of dollars per annum. For Dawn's organization, that would be counterproductive. It'd be probably way too much money in too short of a time. The administrative burden, she's looking at me like, no. But there are many organizations that look at the federal government and all they want is $25,000, which might sound like a lot, but for us, it's not a lot of money. And oftentimes, I think the private sector is far better and more adroit and reduces the administrative burden in making that award, because we're still bound by all of 200 CFR and all the requirements of grant making, whereas the private sector can say, we just want a accounting of funds and go, So there's a number of different ways that we could be looking at this.
I like those. Rachel, I'm going to give you a chance, since you're only here virtually, it's hard to jump in. Do you want to share an idea? We have just a couple minutes here.
Sure. I think it's a really astute question, because the solution isn't just more money. It's building a community that can talk to each other, that persists over time, that's actually learning from the data. But I would challenge that you don't want to be too rationalized, because you need innovation. And a too rational community can stick to really safe areas. And also, when you bring different groups together, my college senior essay was on public-private partnerships. And what I found was that, now you're all hearing my senior research, was that if you bring them together in ways that boost what they each do well, they can work very well. And if you bring them together in ways that bring them each to what they each do worst, they each will do everything worse. So you don't want to bring everything to the slowness of government, the risk aversion of foundations, and the smallness of individual donors. You want it the other way around. So I think what you're really looking for here is to have a philanthropic community that you're building, where there's regular meetings that are constantly being informed by experts and by groups in the field. And that philanthropic community cuts across all those areas: government, foundations, venture capitalists, individuals. And then they're in conversation with one another. They might also pool some money. You could have pooled M&E. You could have pooled applied research funding built in, since they all benefit from M&E and applied research. And they could have a similar table for groups that they fund, so that the groups that they fund are learning together, sharing information and so on, and reporting back to that group. But you don't necessarily want them to be all agreeing on what they fund, because that would actually reduce innovation in the field. And right now we need a lot more innovation.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Ilana, do you want to give us one real quick? And then Dawn, I'm going to let you close this out.
Okay, so I definitely agree with the ideas of bringing everybody together. I think what we really need to do is understand what each other's strengths are, and where it makes sense for it to be government, where it makes sense for it to be private foundation, and where it makes sense for it to be venture capital or private investment. And one of the ways I've seen that work, at least with universities and private investment, is when researchers are getting started on a project that they believe could be a business, bringing folks in early to talk to them, and I mean government funding experts, venture capitalists, foundations, and to talk to them about what do you need to do if you want to turn this research into something where you can get a government grant, into something where it'll turn into a company, into something where a foundation will support it. And having them right from the beginning understand what the requirements would be. And then when they do the research, they're doing that with the end in mind. And that requires all of us to be talking. I know VCs, we talk on a regular basis basis because we don't all invest in the same things. But what's important is we understand what the other person's interested in. And so we're able to direct good ideas to the right funding source. And, this is an opportunity. We've all met each other is to get together on a regular basis and share.
Great. Dawn?
So now let me say, but you have this $100,000, yes, I can spend it and spend it well. Because I'm going to dream big, because what we started in the state of Maryland with our ROTC cadets, I envision that this can go across the nation. And there are over 200 ROTC commands that can use that same type of training. So I say, bring it on. We can do something with it.
Sure.
So that is a great closer, and I will just think back, as you all will join me doing, to Chris Buckley, who talked about people coming out of the service who need this support. We've heard a lot of people talking about data, about people with military backgrounds, and what I'm hearing here is a survivor-led idea based on human beings coming together before things happen to build some fellowship. So I think there are some great ideas coming out of this panel. Thank you all for joining us and for sharing your ideas, and really appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Thank you.